Sarah Martinez had been working the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital for 12 years, but she had never seen anything like the chaos that unfolded on that cold February evening. The emergency room was already packed beyond capacity when the call came in about a massive car accident on the interstate. Multiple vehicles were involved, and ambulances were racing toward the hospital with victims in critical condition. As the first ambulance pulled into the emergency bay, Sarah could see through the glass doors that this was going to be unlike any other night. The paramedics rushed in with a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Her breathing was shallow, and blood soaked through the white sheets covering her body. The trauma team immediately took over, wheeling her into the nearest available room. Sarah had trained for moments like these, but what she witnessed next would challenge everything she believed about her profession and her duty to save lives. Dr. Richards, the head of emergency medicine, took one look at the woman's chart and the extent of her injuries, then made a decision that sent shockwaves through the medical team. He declared that the woman's injuries were too severe and that their resources would be better used on patients with higher chances of survival. The hospital was operating under crisis protocols that night. With limited beds, equipment, and staff, difficult decisions had to be made about who would receive treatment and who would have to wait. It was a cold calculation that weighed chances of survival against available resources, but Sarah couldn't accept that this young woman, whose heart was still beating and who was still fighting for life, would be written off so easily. As Dr. Richards moved on to the next patient, Sarah remained by the woman's bedside. She checked her vital signs and noticed that while they were weak, they were still present. The woman's eyes occasionally fluttered open, showing signs of consciousness. Sarah had seen patients with similar injuries recover before, though it required intensive care and unwavering attention. She believed that giving up on this patient was premature and wrong. When Sarah attempted to administer additional pain medication and begin more aggressive treatment, Dr. Richards returned and firmly told her to step away from the patient. He explained that they needed to focus their efforts on patients who had realistic chances of survival. The resources being used on this woman could save 2 or 3 other patients who were more likely to make it through the night. Sarah understood the logic behind triage protocols, but something deep inside her refused to accept that this woman's life was worth less than others. She had taken an oath to do no harm and to preserve life whenever possible. Looking at the young woman's face, she saw someone's daughter, perhaps someone's sister or mother. This wasn't just a medical case or a statistic. This was a human being who deserved every chance to live. The tension in the emergency room was palpable as other staff members watched the confrontation between Sarah and Dr. Richards. Some agreed with the doctor's assessment, understanding that difficult choices had to be made during crisis situations. Others sympathized with Sarah's position, but were afraid to challenge the established hierarchy and protocols. The pressure was mounting for Sarah to follow orders and move on to other patients. Despite the mounting pressure from her colleagues and superiors, Sarah made a decision that would define her career and possibly change the trajectory of a young woman's life. She quietly continued to monitor the patient, checking her vital signs every few minutes and ensuring that she remained as comfortable as possible. She refused to abandon her post even though she knew that her defiance could have serious consequences for her job and her future in medicine. As the night wore on, the emergency room continued to receive more patients from the accident. The chaos and noise created a perfect cover for Sarah's continued care of the woman everyone else had given up on. She worked discreetly, using her own break time to stay by the patient's side and ensuring that the woman's condition didn't deteriorate further. Sarah knew that she was taking a significant risk, but she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try everything possible to save this life. The woman's condition remained critical but stable throughout the early hours of the morning. Sarah noticed small improvements in her breathing and occasional responses to voice commands. These were subtle signs that others might have missed, but Sarah's experienced eye caught every detail. She began to believe that with proper treatment and care, this woman might actually have a chance to survive against all odds. By dawn, word of Sarah's defiance had spread throughout the hospital. Dr. Richards discovered that she had continued treating the patient despite his direct orders to cease aggressive care. He was furious, not just because his authority had been challenged, but because he believed Sarah's actions were interfering with the efficient operation of the emergency department during a crisis. The confrontation that followed was intense and public. Dr. Richards called Sarah into the hallway where other staff members could hear their heated exchange. He accused her of insubordination and reminded her that medical decisions were made by doctors, not nurses. He explained that her emotional attachment to one patient was preventing her from seeing the bigger picture and potentially costing other lives. Sarah stood her ground, speaking with a conviction that surprised even herself. She argued that the woman was showing signs of improvement and that abandoning her now would be tantamount to murder. She pointed out that the hospital's mission was to save lives, not to make calculated decisions about who deserved to live based on statistics and probabilities. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described the small improvements she had observed throughout the night. Dr. Richards was unmoved by Sarah's passionate plea. He reminded her that medical protocols existed for good reasons and that individual feelings couldn't override established procedures. He threatened to have her removed from the emergency department and warned that her nursing license could be at risk if she continued to disobey direct orders. The ultimatum was clear: follow instructions or face serious consequences. Other nurses watched this confrontation with mixed feelings. Some admired Sarah's courage and dedication to her patient, remembering times when they had felt similar conflicts between their hearts and hospital policies. Others worried about the precedent being set and the potential chaos that could result if every nurse decided to follow their own judgment rather than medical protocols. Despite the threats and pressure, Sarah refused to abandon the young woman. She requested to be reassigned to that patient exclusively, arguing that if the hospital was willing to write her off anyway, at least one staff member should stay with her to ensure dignity and comfort in her final hours. This request put Dr. Richards in a difficult position, as removing Sarah entirely might create staffing problems during an already chaotic shift. The hospital administrator was called in to mediate the situation. Margaret Thompson had been running St. Mary's for over 15 years and had seen her share of conflicts between medical staff. However, this situation was particularly complex because it involved both medical protocols and ethical considerations. She needed to balance the need for order and efficiency with the hospital's commitment to compassionate care. After speaking with both Dr. Richards and Sarah separately, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone. She allowed Sarah to continue caring for the patient but assigned an additional nurse to monitor the situation closely. This compromise meant that Sarah could continue her care while ensuring that other patients weren't neglected. It was an unusual arrangement that highlighted the complexity of the ethical dilemma they were facing. As Sarah returned to her patient's bedside, she felt a mixture of relief and determination. She knew that she had won only a temporary victory, and that the woman's survival was far from guaranteed. However, she was grateful for the opportunity to continue fighting for a life that others had already given up on. She understood that her career at the hospital might be over regardless of the outcome, but she couldn't live with the alternative. The young woman's condition continued to fluctuate throughout the morning. There were moments when her vital signs improved significantly, giving Sarah hope that her instincts had been correct. During other periods, the woman's condition deteriorated, making it seem like Dr. Richards' assessment might have been accurate. These ups and downs were emotionally exhausting for Sarah, who felt personally responsible for every change in the patient's status. Word of the situation began to spread beyond the hospital walls. Some staff members had shared the story with family and friends, and soon local news outlets were asking questions about the incident. The hospital's public relations department was concerned about the potential negative publicity, especially if the story was portrayed as a conflict between compassionate care and cold medical bureaucracy. Sarah remained focused on her patient, trying to block out the external pressure and politics surrounding the situation. She talked to the unconscious woman, sharing stories and encouragement, believing that human connection might play a role in recovery. She had read studies suggesting that patients in comas could sometimes hear and respond to familiar voices and positive encouragement. As the day progressed, Sarah began to notice more definitive signs of improvement in the woman's condition. Her breathing became stronger and more regular, and her responses to stimuli became more consistent. These changes were subtle but significant to someone with Sarah's experience and training. She documented every improvement carefully, knowing that she would need concrete evidence to support her decision to continue treatment. 24 hours after the accident, The young woman opened her eyes for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Sarah was checking her vital signs when she noticed the patient's eyelids fluttering. At first she thought it might be another involuntary muscle response, but then the woman's eyes opened fully and seemed to focus on Sarah's face. The moment was electric and Sarah felt her heart racing with excitement and relief. The woman tried to speak, but the breathing tube prevented any sound from coming out. However, her eyes were alert and responsive, tracking Sarah's movements around the bed. Sarah immediately called for Dr. Richards, knowing that this development would change everything about the patient's prognosis and treatment plan. She could barely contain her excitement as she waited for the medical team to arrive. When Dr. Richards arrived and saw the patient's condition, his expression was a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. He had genuinely believed that the woman's injuries were too severe for survival, and seeing her conscious and responsive challenged his medical assessment. He began a thorough neurological examination to determine the extent of her cognitive function and assess any potential brain damage from the accident. The examination revealed that while the woman had suffered significant trauma, her brain function appeared to be largely intact. She could follow simple commands, respond to questions with eye movements, and showed no signs of the severe neurological damage that had been feared. Her other injuries, while serious, were now clearly treatable with proper medical intervention and time for healing. Dr. Richards found himself in an uncomfortable position. He had made a medical decision based on his experience and the information available at the time, but Sarah's persistence had proven him wrong. This wasn't just about medical accuracy, it was about a fundamental disagreement over how medical decisions should be made and who had the authority to make them. The fact that Sarah had been right didn't necessarily justify her insubordination from a hospital management perspective. The news of the woman's recovery spread quickly throughout the hospital. Staff members who had witnessed the confrontation between Sarah and Dr. Richards were buzzing with discussions about what this meant for hospital protocols and patient care. Some saw it as vindication of Sarah's compassionate approach, while others worried about the precedent it set for challenging medical authority. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction and relief, but she also understood that her actions had created ripple effects throughout the hospital system. She had essentially bet her career on her instincts about one patient, and while she had been proven right in this case, she knew that such defiance couldn't become a regular occurrence without undermining the entire structure of medical care. The patient, whose name was revealed to be Jessica Chen, was a graduate student who had been driving home from the library when the accident occurred. As she became more alert and responsive, Sarah learned that Jessica was working on her master's degree in social work and had dreams of helping underprivileged children. This personal connection made Sarah's decision to fight for her life feel even more meaningful and justified. Jessica's family arrived at the hospital after being notified of the accident and her improved condition. Her parents were overwhelmed with gratitude toward Sarah, having been told initially that their daughter might not survive. They had spent the previous day preparing for the worst possible outcome, and seeing Jessica conscious and responsive felt like a miracle to them. The hospital administration was faced with a complex situation regarding Sarah's future employment. While her actions had ultimately saved a life, they had also violated established protocols and challenged medical authority in a very public way. Margaret Thompson had to balance recognition of Sarah's successful instincts with the need to maintain order and hierarchy within the hospital system. Media attention continued to grow as word of the story spread beyond the hospital. Local news stations were interested in covering the story of a nurse who had refused to give up on a patient that doctors had written off. The hospital's public relations team was working to manage the narrative, wanting to highlight the positive outcome while downplaying any suggestion that the hospital's protocols were inadequate or inhumane. Dr. Richards privately admitted to Sarah that her persistence had saved Jessica's life, but he maintained that her methods were inappropriate and potentially dangerous. He argued that medical decisions couldn't be made based on emotional responses, and that protocols existed to ensure the best outcomes for the greatest number of patients. The philosophical divide between them remained significant despite the positive outcome. Sarah continued to care for Jessica as she progressed through recovery, taking personal satisfaction in watching her patient's strength return day by day. Jessica's cognitive functions remained sharp, and her physical injuries were healing better than anyone had initially expected. The bond between nurse and patient had become deeply personal, transcending the typical professional relationship. As Jessica's condition continued to improve, Sarah began to reflect on the broader implications of what had happened. She realized that her actions had forced the hospital to confront difficult questions about patient care, medical authority, and the role of individual judgment in life and death situations. The outcome had been positive in this case, but similar situations in the future would require careful consideration of all the factors involved. A week after the accident, Jessica was stable enough to be moved from the intensive care unit to a regular hospital room. The breathing tube had been removed and she could speak clearly, though her voice was still weak from the trauma. Her first words to Sarah were simple but profound. "Thank you for not giving up on me." These words carried enormous weight, as Jessica had been told about Sarah's fight to continue her care when others wanted to stop. The conversation between Sarah and Jessica revealed the depth of what had transpired. Jessica explained that she could remember fragments of consciousness during her darkest hours, including Sarah's voice encouraging her to keep fighting. She described feeling Sarah's presence as a lifeline that prevented her from slipping away completely. This revelation added an emotional dimension to Sarah's decision that no medical protocol could have anticipated or addressed. Dr. Richards visited Jessica during her recovery and was struck by her intelligence, warmth, and obvious potential for contributing to society. Meeting her as a person rather than just a medical case gave him a new perspective on the decisions that had been made during that chaotic night. He began to understand why Sarah had been so determined to fight for her life. Though he still struggled with the broader implications for medical practice, the hospital administration convened a special committee to review the incident and its implications for future patient care. The committee included doctors, nurses, administrators, and even an ethicist from the local university. They were tasked with examining whether current protocols needed to be modified and how similar situations should be handled in the future. Sarah was asked to present her perspective to the committee, which felt both like an honor and an interrogation. During her presentation to the committee, Sarah spoke passionately about the importance of individual patient advocacy and the danger of reducing human lives to statistics and probabilities. She acknowledged that protocols were necessary for efficient medical care, but argued that they should never completely override human judgment and compassion. Her testimony was compelling and forced the committee members to grapple with fundamental questions about medical ethics. The committee's discussions revealed deep philosophical divisions within the medical community about how decisions should be made in crisis situations. Some members argued that Sarah's actions, while well-intentioned, could lead to chaos if every healthcare worker decided to follow their personal instincts rather than established protocols. Others contended that rigid adherence to rules could result in preventable deaths, and that individual judgment should play a larger role in patient care. Media coverage of the story continued to expand, with national news outlets picking up the story of the nurse who had defied orders to save a patient's life. Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of compassionate health care. Though she was uncomfortable with the attention, she preferred to focus on patient care rather than public recognition. But she understood that her story had resonated with people who had their own experiences with medical bureaucracy. Jessica's recovery progressed remarkably well, defying the grim predictions that had been made during her first night in the hospital. Physical therapy helped her regain strength and mobility, and psychological counseling addressed the trauma of the accident. Her determination to recover was partly inspired by her gratitude toward Sarah and her desire to prove that the fight for her life had been worthwhile. The relationship between Sarah and Jessica evolved beyond the typical nurse-patient dynamic. Jessica's family had essentially adopted Sarah as an honorary family member, inviting her to family gatherings and staying in touch long after the hospital stay ended. This personal connection reinforced Sarah's belief that every patient deserved to be seen as an individual human being with infinite potential and value. Sarah's colleagues were divided in their opinions about her actions and their aftermath. Some viewed her as a hero who had stood up for what was right, while others worried that she had set a dangerous precedent that could undermine medical authority and hospital efficiency. The tension within the hospital staff reflected broader societal debates about individual rights versus institutional authority. Dr. Richards found himself re-examining his own approach to medicine and patient care. While he still believed in the importance of protocols and evidence-based medicine, Jessica's recovery had shown him that there were aspects of healing that couldn't be quantified or predicted through standard medical assessments. He began to incorporate more flexibility into his decision-making process, though he remained cautious about abandoning established procedures. The hospital's public relations department worked to frame the story in a way that highlighted the institution's commitment to compassionate care while avoiding any suggestion that their protocols were inadequate. They emphasized that the positive outcome was the result of teamwork and the hospital's willingness to adapt to unusual circumstances. However, the underlying tension between rules and individual judgment remained unresolved. As Jessica's discharge date approached, she and Sarah spent time discussing the broader impact of what had happened. Jessica expressed her intention to use her experience as motivation for her future work in social services, wanting to advocate for people who might not have strong voices to speak for themselves. She saw her survival as carrying a responsibility to make a positive difference in the world. The committee's final report recommended changes to hospital protocols that would allow for more flexibility in extreme cases while maintaining overall standards of care. They proposed a system where individual healthcare workers could request secondary reviews of difficult decisions, creating a formal process for challenging initial assessments when circumstances warranted. It was a compromise that acknowledged both the need for structure and the value of individual judgment. 3 months after the accident, Jessica walked out of the hospital under her own power, having made a nearly complete recovery that amazed everyone involved in her care. The moment was captured by local news cameras, showing her embracing Sarah in the hospital lobby, while her parents looked on with tears of joy. The image would become iconic, representing the power of refusing to give up on human life even when the odds seemed impossible. Sarah had expected that her defiance of hospital protocols might result in disciplinary action, or even termination. But the positive publicity and Jessica's remarkable recovery had changed the dynamic significantly. Instead of facing punishment, she found herself being recognized as an advocate for patient-centered care. The hospital administration, perhaps influenced by the positive media coverage, chose to frame her actions as an example of the institution's commitment to going above and beyond for patients. The new protocols that emerged from the committee's recommendations were implemented gradually throughout the hospital system. Healthcare workers were now able to request formal reviews of triage decisions in extreme cases, and a rapid response team was established to provide second opinions when individual staff members felt that patients were being prematurely written off. Sarah was asked to help train other nurses on how to navigate these new procedures effectively. Jessica returned to her graduate studies with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of human resilience. Her thesis project focused on healthcare advocacy and the importance of individual voices in medical decision-making. She had gained first-hand experience of how institutional protocols could sometimes conflict with individual needs, and she wanted to use her academic work to explore solutions to these complex problems. The story of Sarah and Jessica's experience began to influence healthcare policies beyond their local hospital. Medical schools started incorporating discussions about the balance between protocols and individual judgment into their curricula. Nursing programs emphasized the importance of patient advocacy and the ethical responsibilities that came with healthcare professions. The case became a teaching tool for exploring complex medical ethics. Dr. Richards underwent his own transformation in the months following the incident. While he remained committed to evidence-based medicine and the importance of protocols, he began to advocate for more nuanced approaches to difficult cases. He collaborated with Sarah on several research projects examining how individual healthcare worker instincts could be better integrated into medical decision-making processes without compromising overall patient safety. Sarah received numerous speaking invitations from healthcare organizations, medical conferences, and nursing schools. She was initially reluctant to accept these opportunities, preferring to focus on direct patient care, but she gradually realized that sharing her experience could potentially influence how similar situations were handled in other hospitals. Her presentations emphasized the importance of seeing patients as complete human beings, rather than just medical cases. The relationship between Sarah and Jessica's family deepened over time, with Sarah being invited to Jessica's graduation ceremony and other major life events. Jessica's parents often spoke about how Sarah had not only saved their daughter's life, but had also restored their faith in the healthcare system. They became advocates for patient rights and worked to support other families facing similar medical crises. Jessica's recovery was not without challenges, as she dealt with both physical and emotional aftermath of the accident. However, her experience with Sarah's advocacy had given her a model for persistence and fighting for what she believed was right. She applied these lessons to her own recovery process and later to her professional work helping vulnerable populations navigate complex social service systems. The media attention surrounding the story eventually faded, but the impact on healthcare practices continued to ripple through the medical community. Other hospitals began examining their own protocols and considering how they could create more flexibility for unusual cases. Professional medical organizations started developing guidelines for balancing efficiency with individual patient advocacy. Sarah found that her experience had fundamentally changed how she approached nursing. She became more confident in advocating for her patients and more willing to question decisions that didn't seem to serve their best interests. However, she also learned to work within the system more effectively, using the new protocols and procedures to achieve better outcomes for patients while maintaining professional relationships with colleagues. The bond between Sarah and Jessica evolved into a lifelong friendship that transcended their original nurse-patient relationship. Jessica credited Sarah not only with saving her life, but with teaching her about the importance of fighting for others who might not be able to fight for themselves. This lesson influenced Jessica's career choices and her approach to social work with disadvantaged populations. Dr. Richards and Sarah eventually developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect. Despite their initial conflict, they found ways to collaborate that honored both medical expertise and nursing intuition. Their partnership became a model for other healthcare teams struggling to balance protocol compliance with individual patient needs. The hospital administration recognized that the incident had ultimately strengthened their institution's reputation for compassionate care. They used the story in recruitment materials for new staff, emphasizing their commitment to supporting healthcare workers who advocated for their patients. The organization became known as a place where individual judgment was valued, alongside medical protocols. As Jessica approached the one-year anniversary of her accident, she and Sarah reflected on how their lives had been changed by that chaotic night in the emergency room. Both women had grown from the experience, gaining deeper understanding of healthcare ethics, personal courage, and the importance of fighting for what they believed was right, even when facing significant opposition. 1 year after the accident, Jessica graduated with her master's degree in social work, delivering a commencement speech that credited her survival to Sarah's refusal to give up on her. The speech was emotional and powerful, describing how the experience had taught her that individual advocacy could overcome institutional barriers. She announced her intention to establish a foundation focused on patient advocacy and healthcare reform, with Sarah serving as an honorary board member. The foundation, named Second Chances Healthcare Advocacy, began working with hospitals across the country to implement policies that better balanced efficiency with individual patient needs. Jessica used her personal story and academic background to demonstrate how small changes in hospital protocols could have profound impacts on patient outcomes. The foundation's work attracted support from healthcare professionals who had experienced similar ethical dilemmas in their own careers. Sarah was promoted to a new position as Patient Advocacy Coordinator at St. Mary's Hospital, a role created specifically to address the issues highlighted by her experience with Jessica. In this position, she worked with medical teams to ensure that patient voices were heard in difficult decisions and that individual circumstances were properly considered alongside standard protocols. Her unique perspective, combining clinical experience with demonstrated patient advocacy, made her highly effective in this role. The new position allowed Sarah to influence patient care on a broader scale, while still maintaining direct contact with patients and families. She developed training programs for healthcare workers on patient advocacy, emphasizing the importance of seeing each patient as an individual with unique circumstances and potential. Her programs became models that were adopted by other hospitals seeking to improve their patient-centered care approaches. Dr. Richards became a champion for the reforms that had emerged from the Jessica Chen case, speaking at medical conferences about the importance of flexibility in emergency medicine. He collaborated with Sarah on research projects examining how patient outcomes could be improved when healthcare workers were empowered to advocate for individual cases. Their partnership demonstrated that medical authority and nursing advocacy could work together effectively. Jessica's work with the foundation brought her into contact with other patients and families who had faced similar situations in hospitals across the country. She discovered that Sarah's experience was not unique, and that many healthcare workers struggled with conflicts between their personal convictions and institutional protocols. The foundation began documenting these cases and working to create systemic changes that would prevent future ethical dilemmas. The reforms implemented at St. Mary's Hospital began to show measurable results in patient satisfaction and outcomes. The new protocols for requesting second opinions and advocating for individual patients were being used regularly, and healthcare workers reported feeling more empowered to speak up when they believed patients weren't receiving appropriate care. The hospital's reputation for compassionate care continued to grow, attracting both patients and talented healthcare professionals. Sarah's speaking engagements had evolved from simply telling her story to providing practical guidance for healthcare workers facing similar ethical dilemmas. She developed workshops on effective patient advocacy that taught nurses and other healthcare workers how to navigate complex situations while maintaining professional relationships and working within institutional frameworks. These workshops became highly sought after by healthcare organizations nationwide. The relationship between Sarah and Jessica had become a powerful symbol of what was possible when healthcare workers and patients worked together as partners in care. Their story was featured in medical textbooks and case studies, illustrating the complex ethical issues that arise in modern healthcare and demonstrating positive outcomes when individual advocacy is supported and valued. Jessica's recovery had been so complete that she was able to pursue an active lifestyle, including running marathons to raise money for the foundation. Each race served as a reminder of how close she had come to death, and how Sarah's refusal to give up had made her continued life possible. Her athletic achievements garnered additional media attention for the foundation's work and the importance of patient advocacy. The impact of their story extended beyond healthcare into broader discussions about individual rights versus institutional authority. Legal scholars, ethicists, and policymakers referenced the case when discussing how organizations could maintain necessary structure while still allowing for individual judgment and advocacy. The story became a touchstone for conversations about reform in various institutional settings. Sarah found that her experience had given her a unique perspective on healthcare leadership. She was invited to serve on hospital committees and healthcare policy boards, where her advocacy background provided valuable insights into patient needs and concerns. Her voice carried weight because of her demonstrated willingness to put patient welfare above her own career interests. The success of the foundation's advocacy work led to partnerships with major medical organizations and healthcare policy groups. Jessica's academic credentials, combined with her personal experience, created credibility that allowed the foundation to influence policy discussions at national levels. The organization became a respected voice in healthcare reform debates, always emphasizing the importance of individual patient advocacy within systematic approaches to medical care. As the second anniversary of the accident approached, both Sarah and Jessica reflected on how their lives had been fundamentally changed by that night in the emergency room. What had begun as a crisis had evolved into a mission that was improving healthcare for countless patients. Their partnership had demonstrated that individual courage and advocacy could create lasting systemic change when supported by institutional commitment to reform. 5 years after that pivotal night in the emergency room, Sarah and Jessica had transformed their personal experience into a nationwide movement for healthcare reform. The Sarah Martinez Patient Advocacy Protocol had been adopted by over 200 hospitals across the country, providing a formal framework for healthcare workers to challenge triage decisions and advocate for individual patients. The protocol balanced the need for efficient emergency care with recognition that individual circumstances sometimes required deviation from standard procedures. Jessica's foundation had grown into a major nonprofit organization with a staff of 15 and an annual budget of over $2 million. The foundation provided training, resources, and support for patient advocates in hospitals nationwide. They had successfully lobbied for legislation in 12 states requiring hospitals to have formal patient advocacy programs, ensuring that other families wouldn't face the helplessness that Jessica's parents had experienced during those first critical hours. Sarah had been promoted to Director of Patient Advocacy for the entire hospital system, overseeing similar programs in 6 hospitals across the region. Her department had documented over 300 cases where individual advocacy had resulted in improved patient outcomes, providing concrete evidence that the reforms were saving lives. The data showed that patient satisfaction scores had increased significantly at hospitals implementing the advocacy protocols. The academic world had embraced their story as well, with multiple research studies examining the impact of individual advocacy on patient outcomes. Jessica had completed her doctorate in healthcare policy and was now a professor at the state university, teaching courses on healthcare ethics and patient advocacy. Her research focused on developing systematic approaches to incorporating individual judgment into medical decision-making processes. Dr. Richards had become an unexpected ally in promoting the reforms, speaking at medical conferences about his own transformation from strict protocol adherence to a more flexible approach that valued individual patient circumstances. His evolution had been particularly powerful because it demonstrated that experienced physicians could adapt their practices without compromising medical excellence. He often shared the stage with Sarah at medical conferences, their partnership illustrating how doctors and nurses could work together effectively. The media attention had long since faded, but the institutional changes continued to spread throughout the healthcare system. Medical schools were now required to include courses on patient advocacy and healthcare ethics, ensuring that future doctors and nurses would be better prepared to navigate the complex situations that Sarah and Jessica had faced. The curriculum changes had been influenced directly by their foundation's advocacy and research. Sarah's personal life had been enriched by her advocacy work, as she had met her husband through the foundation's activities. He was a healthcare attorney who specialized in patient rights, and their shared commitment to healthcare reform had formed the foundation of their relationship. They had 2 young children and often spoke about how they hoped to raise them with the same commitment to fighting for others that had driven Sarah's actions that night. Jessica had also found love through her advocacy work, marrying a fellow social worker who shared her passion for helping vulnerable populations. They worked together on several foundation projects and had recently welcomed their first child. Jessica often reflected on how her survival had led not only to her own continued life but to the creation of new life and the potential for future generations to benefit from the reforms they had initiated. The hospital where it all began had become a model for patient-centered care, attracting visitors from healthcare systems around the world who wanted to learn about their advocacy programs. The institution took pride in the fact that the reforms had emerged from their own staff's commitment to individual patient welfare. They had established an annual Sarah Martinez Award for outstanding patient advocacy, recognizing healthcare workers who went above and beyond for their patients. The ripple effects of their story continued to expand into other areas of healthcare policy. The principles of individual advocacy and systematic flexibility that they had championed were being applied to long-term care facilities, mental health institutions, and rehabilitation centers. The foundation had expanded its mission to address patient advocacy needs across the entire spectrum of healthcare services. Sarah and Jessica maintained their close friendship, with their families spending holidays together and their children growing up as close as cousins. The bond forged during those critical hours in the emergency room had evolved into a lifelong partnership that continued to drive positive change in healthcare. They often marveled at how a single night of crisis had led to decades of meaningful work, improving patient care for countless individuals. As they looked toward the future, both women remained committed to expanding their advocacy work and ensuring that the lessons learned from Jessica's near-death experience would continue to benefit patients for generations to come. They had proven that individual courage, when combined with systematic reform and institutional support, could create lasting change that saved lives and improved the human experience of healthcare. The legacy of that February night when Sarah refused to give up on a dying patient had become a testament to the power of individual advocacy and the importance of seeing every patient as a unique human being, deserving of every possible chance for survival. Their story continued to inspire healthcare workers around the world to stand up for their patients and fight for what they believed was right, even when facing significant institutional pressure to conform to standard protocols.